Welcome to the Third Sector podcast, brought to you by the Third Sector editorial team. In this episode, we'll be asking why charities working in reform council areas are so reluctant to talk about the implications of a potentially more widespread shift to the political right. We'll be considering whistleblowing rights, or the lack thereof, for trustees. And we'll be talking about charities being on the receiving end of so-called lawfare. I'm your host, Lucinda Rouse, and I'm joined by Emily Harle.
Hello.
Andy Ricketts.
Hello.
And Dami Adewale.
Hello.
This is our monthly episode where we don't have a guest joining us. It takes the form of an editorial team meeting in which we consider a few recent stories that have raised some interesting points. And first up, Emily, tell us what you're bringing to the table.
So over the past month, we've been seeing multiple cases of what we've been dubbing charity lawfare pass over the Third Sector news desk. So essentially, these are cases where a legal case has been brought against a charity on what some might describe as rather vexatious grounds. Often, even if these cases do not stand a chance of resulting in a ruling against the charity, they can cost organisations precious time, money, and distract their resources away from their mission. I wanted to talk about two particular examples of lawfare from this month alone, which I think show the breadth of the problem. One is a racial discrimination case that has been lodged against a small charity called the 10,000 Interns Foundation. And the second one is a legal threat that has been brought against the major disability charity Scope, which alleges it discriminated against a group of choristers for their founders' gender-critical beliefs.
So let's start with the 10,000 Interns Foundation. What's been going on there?
So this charity, like I said, is a small charity, and it provides internships for Black and minority ethnic young people to challenge underrepresentation in the workplace. And it runs a programme called 10,000 Black Interns alongside the Bar Council. Now, GB News commentator Sophie Corcoran has brought a case against the two organisations after applying to that programme, claiming she was discriminated against for being white. She claims she has faced a loss of employment opportunity and says her case aims to challenge practices that discriminate on racial grounds. The charity and the Bar Council have both defended their work, and the latter has said that it's already filed its defence and denies all of the allegations. The 10,000 Interns Foundation said it is confident in the legal basis of its work, which is grounded in the Equality Act and reflects established principles of lawful, proportionate, positive action.
She's quite bold, isn't she, to be initiating legal action against the Bar Council. For a small charity, they've got an income of less than £1 million, according to their last annual accounts. Fighting a case like this is obviously going to be really big and really difficult. We know that charities are already stretched without needing to fork out massive legal fees. How is the charity doing in all of this?
Yeah, so as you said, the charity is a really small outfit. And The Guardian has reported that after right-wing campaigns last year, some companies have already pulled their support from the internship scheme. So this latest lawsuit could threaten the charity's sustainability. But we have seen lots of organisations coming out in support of the charity, which is really positive to see, including the Good Law Project, which launched a crowdfunder to support its costs. And that crowdfunder has raised more than £6,700 at the time of recording. We also know the charity has launched its own fundraiser, although you can't see the exact figure on that page. And we know it is receiving some pro bono legal support.
On the flip side, Sophie Corcoran's own crowd fundraiser has raised £8,938 at the time of recording. But enough of that. Tell us about the second case you mentioned, Scope.
Yeah, so Scope is sort of on the other end of the scale. It's a major charity and it's quite well known. And the legal action that it has been threatened with has been initiated by 4 members of the Singing Striders, which is a choir that has previously performed for Scope at the sidelines of the London Marathon, but it was dropped in the days leading up to the 2026 event. The charity had told singers that it would not be appropriate for the charity to be represented by the choir's founder, Janet Murray, who is an openly gender-critical journalist. She has publicly said she does not believe people can change their sex and has criticised the inclusion of transgender women in women's spaces in sports. The charity did restore its invite to the choir the night before the marathon, but that offer was declined, we understand. Now, Murray and 3 other choristers have sent a pre-action letter to Scope advising of plans to sue for unlawful treatment and discrimination over the founder's gender-critical views. I think this is a really important case as well, because not only does it show that this kind of lawfare is affecting charities of all shapes and sizes, but we've seen this kind of lawfare from gender-critical groups before. And it is also worth noting that this case arose just days before the Equality and Human Rights Commission published its long-awaited draft guidance relating to public single-sex spaces, which I'm sure will stir up some debate within the sector and with the sector, and potentially further legal threats relating to this issue.
So 2 cases in the past month, and we've been talking a lot in recent months on societal polarisation and the effects that that is having on charities in various cause areas. Obviously, these 2 are very different charities doing very different things, but both affected by the so-called lawfare. What challenges do you think legal threats like this are likely to pose for charities in the near future?
So there's the sort of fairly obvious point of the cost of battling or defending against legal action. Even just engaging a lawyer to respond to a pre-action letter can cost a charity some very much needed money. But as well as the legal costs, it also takes away staff's time. If you're working with a small team, then that can be really challenging. You'll need to bring in external expertise, it costs resources, and it also distracts your staff from focusing on your mission. So you're no longer spending your time of day focusing on supporting the people you're there to serve. Instead, you're fighting off a really hefty legal case. And let's not forget that a lot of these cases are very well funded. I mean, Sophie Corcoran's fundraiser has already raised more than £8,000. But it also has the potential to make charities wary of standing their ground when it comes to more polarised issues. So we just covered a report by consultants Jim Coe and Natasha Adams, which argued that the fear of being dragged into culture wars is preventing charities from speaking up against the far right. And I do have a concern that vexatious legal cases could amplify that reticence and make charities more fearful of speaking out in those areas that are far more polarised. And we're seeing that play out time and time again. These issues are getting more disruptive, more polarising, and it makes it really hard for charities to stand up for their values.
I mean, it's pretty scary when the 10,000 Interns Foundation say that this lawsuit could threaten their sustainability. You mentioned it in your intro earlier, and it's pretty frightening when you think about the power that people can have over these organisations simply by virtue of having bigger pockets or being supported by people who have deeper pockets, because they can bring these cases seemingly with impunity. And from a point of view of they're quite vexatious. So a lot of the time they're not going to go very far. I mean, I don't think many people, well, maybe Sophie Corcoran is different, but I wouldn't imagine most people will think that her case is actually going to get anywhere. But it causes a huge amount of mischief for the charity. It shines a light on something that will be viewed by some people as a negative thing, even though what the charity is doing is obviously very positive. There's so many things at play, but the fact that this could drive a charity under, and whether they will have the appetite to fight it as well is another question, because as you say, it's so expensive. Even if you want to send a legal letter, it's going to cost a few £100s of lawyers' time, and small charities don't have that sort of cash knocking about.
Yeah, and that's why we're calling it lawfare, really, because even if the case isn't going to sort of go anywhere, as you say, it's still going to really drastically impact the charity that is defending itself. And there is a concern that it could slowly deplete the number of organisations that are working in these specific areas and doing really great work.
Well, and also embolden other people who are considering bringing such cases to do the same. It can have a domino effect across the sector.
I guess the key difference between these 2 cases is that the 10,000 Interns Foundation are experiencing a direct attack on their services, on their programme that they run with the Bar Council. Whereas in the case of Scope, it was having a choir whose leader has certain beliefs that the organisation is not in agreement with, cheerleading their runners at the London Marathon.
Absolutely. And when Scope restored its invite to the choir, it said that it accepted that the choir as a group does not promote a specific viewpoint, and the performance itself doesn't undermine its values. But it did say that gender critical views are highly polarising, and that the charity is sensitive to the fact that for some of its valued members, supporters and colleagues, gender critical beliefs may be upsetting or alienating. So it is very different to the 10,000 Interns Foundation, but it's more about aligning its work and the people representing its work with the values that Scope lives and breathes.
And I do think that perhaps the most important point in all of this is thinking about wider sector implications. How is it going to affect charities' appetite to speak out and stand up for the issues that matter to them? And on the topic of speaking out, we're going to move on now to your story, Dami, which is all about whistleblowing rights.
Yes, so the classical music charity Playground Proms saw its chair, Nigel MacLennan, step down from his role last month. This follows a case that MacLennan was involved in with the British Psychological Society involving whistleblowing rights being granted to trustees. MacLennan lost the case and stepped down from his role at Playground Proms because he deemed the current charity sector environment a hazardous legal environment for trustees.
So tell us a little bit more about this case that he had with the British Psychological Society. How did it come about?
He was expelled from his role as president-elect and trustee in 2021 amid bullying allegations. MacLennan denies the bullying allegations, and at the time he said he was elected to address legitimate concerns at the charity. Following on from this, MacLennan claimed he should have been given whistleblowing rights at the British Psychological Society after alleging governance failings and potential illegal practices at the charity.
And why is this important for the wider sector?
The Employment Tribunal rejected MacLennan's case because it was deemed he was not a British Psychological Society worker and therefore he wasn't a full-time employee at the charity. The judge ruled that trustees are materially different from employees. Employees are classed as subordinate within charities, while the trustee role, in the judge's view, is one of governance and oversight. So based on that point, I think this brings into question whether trustees should have whistleblowing rights considering the high responsibility they have at charities. I also think there's a larger question about trustee responsibility, as there are quite a lot of parallels between MacLennan's gripes and the arguments people make for trustees being paid, for example.
MacLennan's resignation from Playground Proms was really interesting. I was having a read of it before we started as well. I thought where he says that continuing in his role as chair would be to endorse a system that is dysfunctional and broken. Some very strong words. And I think it is an interesting point. Like, to what extent should protections that are being granted for charity staff also be extended to trustees? I mean, trustees are likely to spot governance failings fairly early on into their role. So you want people to be able to disclose these and feel that they are protected to do so. But then a trustee's role is incredibly different to that of an employee.
But it's a bit of a double-edged sword, isn't it? I think for trustees themselves who want to speak out, obviously it's going to be beneficial for them if they're spotting something negative that's going on and they are afforded those whistleblowing protections. The flip side of it, obviously, is that it means that charities are potentially facing fewer employment tribunal cases because they could suddenly find there's a flood of them from trustees who have been dismissed for various reasons. And already we've seen just recently the law change to enable more people to bring employment tribunals more easily. Now, obviously, some are going to say that's a positive move because you need to make sure that workers have got basic rights. Of course, that's important. The other side of that coin is charities, as you've already been speaking about, are facing a difficult legal environment with cases being brought maybe from a vexatious point of view, but also if there's a door open for more employment tribunal cases being brought to them, that's going to take away more focus from what they're trying to do on the front line.
But then there's also a question of, you know, with a case like this coming to light, will other trustees see this and think, oh, I'm not being legally protected here? Is that something I should be giving more thought to? And is that a concern for me? Will people see that as a reason to not continue in their roles when they're doing really great work? You know, on the ground in their charities that they're serving. But there's also the role of the Charity Commission to consider here too, because the Charity Commission does have measures in place for trustees, and we know the Commission has an amount of guidance available for trustees to peruse, but they've said they encourage whistleblowers, whatever connection they have to their charity, to bring serious concerns to the regulator's attention. But the question is, in what way is that support being given to trustees?
Well, there is a charity, is there not, Protect, which is set up to protect and promote whistleblowing rights. What have they got to say about all of this?
Andrew Pepper Parsons at the Protect charity, I'm going to give a direct quote here. He said, "What we really need is for the government and MPs to act quickly and extend whistleblowing protection to include trustees, something ministers already have the power to do via secondary legislation, rather than leave it to whistleblowers to force the change via the courts." So I think that might be possibly the next route in terms of this, looking at more of a governmental perspective in terms of how they can possibly implement these whistleblowing rights for trustees.
Yeah, certainly seems to be a developing story, and it will be interesting to see what the outcome is. Andy, your story is an interesting one because it's actually more of a non-story that brought it onto the table.
Well, what I've been doing is, anybody who's been paying any attention to the political landscape over the last few weeks would have seen that Reform UK won a whole swathe of new councils at the elections earlier on in May. And this follows on from them having a very successful time a year previously, where they also won a load of councils for the first time. So I wanted to look, in the light of the fact that we could be one day facing the prospect of a Reform UK government, I wanted to look at what Reform UK councillors have meant for voluntary sector organisations at local level.
And what did you find?
Well, what I found was that I contacted a whole host of local infrastructure bodies at local level in the areas that last year were taken by Reform UK. There were 10 councils that Reform UK took control of, including 6 county councils in 2025. Ordinarily, when we write these analysis pieces, we maybe have 3 or 4 commentators who will give us views, and you write a piece based on that. I wondered if charities might be slightly reluctant, so I cast the net slightly wider. And I contacted 14 local infrastructure organisations in those areas, and of those only one was prepared to speak to me, and that was on the basis of anonymity.
Quite telling in itself.
Indeed, yeah, and it just goes to show what local organisations are facing in these areas. There's obviously quite a lot of concern around how they interact with these relatively new reform councils.
But also how you publicly speak about your interactions with these reform councils too.
Yeah.
So what did the lone voice have to say?
Well, one thing that I did obviously do in the lead up to this was look at reform policies more broadly to try to get a bit of a sense of what they're talking about, the sort of things they're going to be interested in, so we can get some kind of an idea of what potentially a reform government might look like. And obviously some of the widely publicised things have been around DEI policies and kind of reversing that. Certainly at a council level, they're going to say, as part of their sort of efficiency savings, they want to repeal any local council spending on DEI activity, whether that's specific officers training, any of that sort of stuff. So obviously charities working in those particular areas are going to find an impact. There's obviously the scrapping of net zero. They've been quite vocal about that. They want to row back on any government commitment to progress towards net zero because they think that's a waste of time. They want to have a real focus on efficiency at local level. So from the one person who was prepared to speak to me, there was a number of things that came up around those particular areas. And the person said that in some ways there had been business as usual, partly because there is a bit of a buffer. You know, if you know how local government works, you know that the councillors set the overall priorities and the policies and how the budget is going to be spent. But then obviously the local officers will implement those policies on the behalf of the councillors. And this particular person said that the local officers had been quite good in terms of trying to protect what local voluntary sector organisations have been doing. But the fear is that there is a bit of a chilling effect. And I think we've very much seen this in terms of charities not wanting to speak out about what charities can say, what they can do. And again, a disparity over how different sorts of charities are found working under Reform UK Council.
I don't think it's controversial to say that a lot of Reform's policies directly oppose the cause areas of many charities, as you've mentioned there, Andy. I think it's tough to see how the Refugee Council, for example, would engage with the party, considering the first policy on Reform's list is about stopping the boats.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we know they're going to want to put a cap on overseas aid, for example, which lots of our readers and listeners are going to be very heavily engaged with. The other thing that will be interesting to see is around spending, because obviously the Reform councils want to have a focus on efficiency, spending less, keeping taxes low. Councils obviously have a lot of things they have to spend money on. They have statutory requirements. They have to deal with homelessness. They have to deal with certain elements of social care. They have to deal with schooling, all that kind of stuff. But council budgets, as we all know, have been severely squeezed in recent years. So councils are very much looking for where they can scrub off any kind of bits of fat, as they might see it, in terms of discretionary spending. And in a lot of cases, money that is provided for local charities at local level is going to be that discretionary spending that could potentially be at risk if Reform really wants to drive hard at this efficiency agenda and cut off any unnecessary, in their view, spending.
But in the policies section on the Reform UK website are the words "charity begins at home," which you'd think might be quite heartening for voluntary organisations worried about local level spending cuts. I should point out that that was in the context of severely reducing the international aid cap.
Yeah. I mean, that phrase that you just mentioned, it will all depend on if you're, quotes in Reform's view, the right sort of charity. I mean, Dami obviously raised the issue around migration and how charities working in that sphere, I think, are going to find a very different environment to, say, a charity that runs a local group for struggling families or things that might be viewed as, quotes, the right sort of charity. So I think there will be a disparity over how local organisations are treated according to what work they're trying to achieve.
I think there's also a question around a lot of Reform's policies are very national focused rather than local. And so the question becomes, how many of their policies can they actually be implementing at a local level as local councillors? So things like removing council spending on DEI related activity, that's an obvious one that could potentially be implemented by a Reform council. But then you've got things like stopping the boats. That's more of a national issue. Migration is a national issue. And if you're not a councillor elected in an area that is really severely affected by migration and is one of the areas that gets sort of peddled by Reform politicians, then as a councillor, you're focused on getting the bin sorted, not the boats. So yeah, I think there's just a question there of, to what extent will we see these policies actually playing out when we're at the moment looking at Reform on local level.
And another point that was made to me was the fact that for a lot of these councillors, if not pretty much all of them, they are novices. They haven't done this before. They've been plucked from, if you like, relative obscurity to suddenly become in a position of power at local level. We saw in the last general election how Reform kind of had a huge rush to get people who would be willing to stand for them in constituencies up and down the UK. And obviously that did result in some people putting forward who were obviously unsuitable and had to withdraw from the process. A lot of these councillors are novices. They haven't done this before. So it's going to take them a while to get their feet under the table and understand how local government really works.
That does also apply to the Green Party and their councillors, and indeed potential MP or candidate to be MP having to step down because they had other responsibilities and it was all new and nobody really thought that this was actually going to happen.
And we don't know exactly what the sort of how Reform strides in the local elections will be reflected in a general election at the moment. But one thing I did want to mention as well is we also, alongside local elections, we saw the Scottish Parliament elections, and that brought about a relatively big shift, I would say. I mean, the SNP won 58 seats, but then tied second with Labour was Reform at 17 seats each. Now, it's quite notable that the Reform MSPs didn't necessarily win constituency seats, they won regional seats, which, if you know the Scottish system, it is slightly different. One is first past the post and one is proportionate representation. But that is sort of an interesting case study of the sort of rise of reform, and then also at the same time sort of depletion of Labour support, and the fact that they've both been tied for seats is quite interesting. And I do wonder what it's looking like on the ground in Scotland for charities, or what it will look like in 3-6 months' time as these MSPs get their feet under the table.
And I think the difference as well between Reform and the Green Party, obviously the Green Party have made some gains and won their first councils as well at this local election. But at this point, nobody's considering a possible Green Party-led government.
This is true.
Whereas that's very much a prospect based on the current vote share for Reform UK. And I think there is a potential, the chilling effect that the person I spoke to mentioned to me is quite interesting, because it always feels like we're copying some of the politics from across the Atlantic, where everybody's quite scared of saying something that might upset the President of the United States, because then he's likely to react in a negative way. And I feel like there's a bit of that being played out here at local level across the councils. And to go back to your original question about the piece I was working on, I think pretty much for the first time in my journalistic career, I ended up not being able to produce a piece simply because I couldn't get enough copy to properly fill out a piece, which is extremely unusual. I don't remember it happening in my 20 plus years as a journalist.
Well, it's excellent that we had the opportunity to discuss it here. All was not lost.
And if anyone else wants to have a conversation with us about what it is like operating in a reform-led council area, we would love to hear from you.
Andy is staring at a blank sheet of paper. We hope you enjoyed this episode. We'll be back with another team meeting next month. From all of us at Third Sector, thank you so much for listening. Our producer is Jude Owen.